The morning mist still clung to the towering iron gates as the first rays of sunlight settled over one of the most impressive private estates in America. The mansion stood like a monument to power, its polished windows reflecting a life most people could only imagine. Every stone, every garden, every carefully trimmed hedge told the story of unimaginable wealth. Yet on this particular morning, none of that mattered. What mattered was the young woman standing outside those gates with a faded suitcase clutched tightly in trembling hands. She had traveled from a quiet farming community where opportunities were rare and every dollar mattered. She wasn't dressed in expensive clothes, nor did she carry herself like someone expecting to enter a billionaire's home. Fear filled her eyes, but so did determination. She believed she had come for a simple housekeeping job that could help her support her struggling family. She had no idea that before the sun set, she would become the center of a carefully planned test capable of changing several lives forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened inside this mansion wasn't simply about wealth or marriage. It became a story about trust, loyalty, hidden intentions, and the painful truth that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we understand the least. The gates slowly opened without a sound, and a security guard quietly motioned for the young woman to enter. Every step she took along the winding driveway seemed heavier than the last. Expensive cars rested beneath covered garages. Fountains poured crystal-clear water into marble pools, and perfectly maintained gardens stretched farther than she could see. Everything around her reminded her that she had entered a world completely different from the one she had always known. Moments later, she was escorted through enormous double doors into a grand entrance hall, decorated with priceless artwork, sparkling chandeliers, and polished marble floors that reflected every movement. Waiting for her was the owner of the estate, a billionaire respected across the country for building one of America's largest business empires from almost nothing. Newspapers described him as disciplined, brilliant, and impossible to deceive. Investors admired him, competitors feared him, employees respected him. Yet as he looked into the young woman's anxious eyes, there wasn't a trace of pride on his face. Instead, there was concern, as though he had been carrying a burden that money had never been able to remove. Without wasting a single moment, he spoke words she would never forget. For the next 30 days, everyone must believe you're nothing more than a maid. The young woman blinked in confusion, convinced she had misunderstood him. She had expected instructions about cleaning schedules, uniforms, or the rooms she would be responsible for maintaining. Instead, she found herself staring at a man who was asking her to become part of a secret she couldn't begin to understand. Questions raced through her mind. Why would someone with unlimited resources need a stranger to pretend to be an ordinary maid? Why had he personally interviewed her when hundreds of professional housekeepers could have done the job better? Why insist that every employee remain unaware of the truth? She wanted answers, but something in his calm expression told her that those answers would not come easily. He explained only one condition. She was to perform every task expected of a maid without complaint, speak to no one about their private arrangement, observe everything carefully, and report only to him. If anyone questioned her background, she was to tell the same simple story she had shared during her interview. Nothing more, nothing less. The offer promised enough money to transform her family's future forever, but the mystery surrounding it left her wondering whether she had unknowingly stepped into something far more complicated than ordinary employment. Before she could gather the courage to ask another question, footsteps echoed across the polished floor. The billionaire immediately turned toward the hallway, and the expression on his face shifted so quickly that even the young woman noticed it. A graceful woman entered the room wearing an elegant cream-colored dress, carrying herself with the confidence expected from someone accustomed to luxury and admiration. Her smile appeared warm and welcoming, the kind that made everyone around her feel instantly comfortable. She approached the newcomer with kindness, introducing herself as the lady of the house and offering words that sounded sincere enough to calm any nervous employee on their first day. The young woman smiled politely in return, believing she had just met someone generous and compassionate. Yet while she focused on the wife's pleasant greeting, something else happened that almost escaped notice. The billionaire's eyes never left his wife for more than a second. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't relaxed. He was studying every expression, every movement, every pause in her voice as though searching for something only he could see. The atmosphere inside the magnificent mansion changed without anyone speaking another word, leaving an uncomfortable silence that seemed impossible to explain. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. The wife welcomed the new maid, offered to have one of the senior housekeepers show her around the property, and even thanked her for accepting the position. To anyone watching from the outside, it would have looked like the perfect beginning to a professional relationship inside a happy home. But appearances have a remarkable way of hiding uncomfortable truths. The billionaire remained unusually quiet throughout the brief conversation, answering only when necessary and carefully watching interactions that most people would have ignored. The young woman sensed an invisible tension she couldn't identify. She couldn't understand why a successful husband seemed unable to relax around the woman he had married. She couldn't explain why every polite smile exchanged between them felt rehearsed instead of natural. Most confusing of all, she couldn't understand why she had been placed at the center of whatever was unfolding before her. She had arrived expecting to clean rooms and earn an honest living. Instead, she found herself standing between two people whose marriage seemed perfect to the outside world, but carried questions that no amount of wealth could hide. And that leaves only one question. What was this wealthy man trying to prove? And why was he willing to risk his entire marriage to find out? As the senior housekeeper led the frightened young woman through the endless hallways of the mansion, she tried to steady her breathing, but every step only deepened the questions racing through her mind. She had come from a quiet farming village where everyone knew one another by name, where honesty was measured by a handshake, and where hard work was often the only path to survival. Never in her life had she imagined standing beneath crystal chandeliers, surrounded by priceless paintings and polished marble floors that reflected every movement she made. Yet out of thousands of applicants, it was she who had been summoned by one of America's most successful businessmen. The billionaire had looked directly into her eyes and entrusted her with an assignment unlike anything she had ever heard before. For the next 30 days, everyone must believe you're nothing more than a maid. Those words continued to echo inside her mind as she unpacked her worn suitcase inside a modest staff bedroom tucked away in the servants' wing. She knew almost nothing about the people who lived inside the mansion, and they knew even less about her. Still, she couldn't escape one impossible question. Why had a billionaire deliberately searched beyond wealthy neighborhoods, prestigious employment agencies, and experienced household staff to find an unknown village girl with no connection to his world? There had to be something about her that he valued more than experience or reputation, something he believed money alone could never buy. Whatever that reason was, it remained locked behind a silence he seemed determined to protect. The mystery only grew deeper when she remembered the strict instructions the billionaire had given before his wife entered the grand foyer. He had not simply asked her to perform household duties. He had insisted that every member of the estate believe she was an ordinary maid hired through routine channels. The cooks were never to suspect otherwise. The gardeners could never know. The chauffeurs, security officers, accountants, personal assistants, relatives, and longtime employees all had to accept the same carefully constructed story without question. Even the billionaire's wife was never to discover the truth. It was an extraordinary level of secrecy for what appeared to be a simple household position. She had worked hard her entire life, but she had never imagined that cleaning rooms and serving meals could somehow become part of a hidden mission. As she quietly folded her few belongings into the small wardrobe beside her bed, she began to wonder if every hallway, every conversation, and every ordinary task would soon become another piece of a much larger puzzle. The billionaire had trusted her with something valuable, yet he had revealed almost nothing in return. His silence suggested that one careless word could destroy everything before it even began. Whatever he hoped to uncover depended entirely on no one realizing that the newest maid inside the mansion was there for a purpose far greater than housekeeping. Then her thoughts returned to the woman she had met only minutes earlier. The billionaire's wife had welcomed her with warmth, offering a gentle smile and speaking with kindness that appeared completely genuine. There had been nothing cold or unwelcoming about her. If anything, she seemed like the perfect hostess, graceful, thoughtful, and respected by everyone around her. Yet the young woman couldn't forget what she had witnessed in those brief moments inside the entrance hall. While his wife smiled naturally, the billionaire had remained unusually quiet, carefully studying every expression that crossed her face. It wasn't the look of an angry husband. It wasn't even the expression of someone preparing for an argument. It was the face of a man searching for answers that had escaped him for far too long. Somewhere behind his calm exterior, a quiet suspicion had taken root, powerful enough to make him risk the stability of his own marriage in pursuit of the truth. But what exactly had he seen? Had he noticed changes in his wife's behavior that no one else recognized? Had someone close to the family whispered a warning he could not ignore? Or had a single unexplained event convinced him that the woman he loved was hiding something capable of changing their lives forever? Those questions would remain unanswered for now, but every conversation inside this mansion, every unexpected discovery, and every decision made by the people living under its roof would slowly bring the truth into the light. Nothing would unfold by chance, and every answer waiting ahead would arrive with another revelation that challenged everything the audience believed only moments before. Long before the towering mansion, the private jets, and the billion-dollar business empire became symbols of his success, Richard Lawson was simply a determined boy growing up in a forgotten farming community where every sunrise meant another day of hard labor. His parents owned very little, and what they lacked in money they made up for with relentless determination. Richard learned at an early age that nothing of value came easily. Before school, he helped his father repair broken equipment and tend to the fields. After school, he worked odd jobs around town, saving every dollar he could while watching other children enjoy the carefree childhood he never experienced. There were nights when the family dinner consisted of little more than bread and soup, yet his parents never allowed hardship to become an excuse for giving up. His mother often reminded him that character was built long before success ever arrived, while his father believed a person's word was worth more than any paycheck. Those lessons settled deep inside Richard's heart and quietly shaped every decision he would make for the rest of his life. Even after becoming one of America's most admired entrepreneurs, he often admitted that the greatest education he ever received had not come from prestigious universities or famous business leaders. It had come from watching two ordinary people choose honesty over comfort every single day, even when life gave them every reason to do otherwise. As Richard entered adulthood, he refused to accept the limitations of his circumstances. With little more than determination and an extraordinary willingness to outwork everyone around him, he launched a small business from a rented warehouse that barely stayed open during its first year. Banks rejected his loan applications. Investors dismissed his ideas. Competitors laughed at his ambition, convinced that another struggling startup would soon disappear like so many before it. Yet every setback only strengthened his resolve. He worked through countless sleepless nights, drove thousands of miles to meet potential clients who often turned him away, and reinvested every dollar back into the business instead of rewarding himself. Years passed before the sacrifices finally began to bear fruit. One successful contract led to another, and another after that. The modest company slowly expanded into multiple industries, creating jobs across the country and earning a reputation for integrity that attracted both customers and investors. Newspapers celebrated Richard Lawson as the embodiment of the American dream, a self-made billionaire who had transformed humble beginnings into extraordinary success without forgetting where he came from. To the public, his journey appeared inspiring. Few realized how much loneliness, disappointment, and personal sacrifice had been hidden behind every headline celebrating his achievements. Perhaps even more remarkable than Richard's business success was his extraordinary ability to understand people. Business magazines frequently described him as someone who could walk into a room, exchange only a few words with a stranger, and accurately judge their intentions before a meeting had even ended. Executives often joked that nothing escaped his attention. He noticed hesitation hidden behind confidence, sincerity concealed beneath nervousness, and dishonesty carefully disguised as charm. Over the years, this remarkable instinct protected him from disastrous partnerships, costly investments, and individuals whose promises were far more impressive than their actions. Employees respected him because promotions were earned through integrity rather than flattery. Friends admired him because he valued loyalty above influence. Even competitors acknowledged that Richard Lawson possessed an almost unsettling ability to recognize genuine character beneath polished appearances. Yet despite all his success in business, there remained one area of life where certainty had slowly begun to disappear. The instincts that had guided billion-dollar decisions now whispered questions he desperately wished were untrue. Those quiet doubts had nothing to do with boardrooms, contracts, or financial markets. They lived much closer to home, inside the walls of the magnificent mansion where the people he loved most surrounded him every day. Looking back on everything he had accomplished, Richard often reflected on a lesson that success had forced him to learn through experience rather than ambition. Every promotion, every acquisition, every new fortune introduced him to people whose behavior changed the moment wealth entered the conversation. Some arrived offering friendship that vanished when opportunities disappeared. Others praised loyalty while quietly pursuing their own interests. Time after time, Richard discovered that wealth had a remarkable way of exposing motives that ordinary circumstances kept hidden. Eventually, one belief settled firmly in his mind and never left him. Success had taught him one painful lesson. Money never changes people. It reveals them. That conviction shaped the way he hired employees, selected business partners, and built relationships. It also explained why he had chosen an unknown village girl instead of an experienced professional to enter his household unnoticed. He believed the purest truths often emerged when people assumed no one important was watching. But as Richard stood at the window of his mansion that morning, quietly watching the newest maid disappear down the hallway, another unsettling thought crossed his mind. What if the greatest deception of his life wasn't waiting inside a boardroom or hidden within a business deal? What if it had been living under the same roof with him all along? That single question would soon set into motion a chain of events from which no one inside the Lawson mansion would emerge unchanged. If Richard Lawson represented determination and discipline, then his wife, Evelyn Lawson, seemed to embody grace and compassion. Across America, her name was associated with generosity rather than luxury, and although she lived a life surrounded by extraordinary wealth, she had carefully built a reputation that extended far beyond expensive homes and exclusive events. Newspapers regularly featured photographs of Evelyn opening children's hospitals, funding scholarships for students from struggling communities, and hosting charity galas that raised millions of dollars for families facing unimaginable hardships. Television interviews painted her as warm, thoughtful, and remarkably humble, despite the fortune she shared with her husband. Those who met her in public often described her as approachable, someone who listened more than she spoke, and remembered the names of people long after a brief introduction. At fundraising dinners, she greeted every guest with the same genuine smile. At community events, she never rushed past volunteers or overlooked the people working quietly behind the scenes. To the outside world, Evelyn Lawson appeared to be the perfect partner for one of America's most respected businessmen. Together, Richard and Evelyn were celebrated as the couple who had proven that success and kindness could exist side by side. Their marriage became the standard against which many others were measured, admired not only for its longevity, but also for the dignity with which they carried themselves through decades of public attention. Very few people questioned the image they had created, because there seemed to be no reason to doubt it. Inside the mansion, Evelyn continued to present herself with the same elegance that had earned the admiration of countless people across the country. Every morning she greeted members of the household with calm confidence, thanking the cooks for breakfast, complimenting the gardeners on the beautiful grounds, and asking after employees' families as though each person genuinely mattered to her. The newer staff quickly found themselves impressed by her kindness, while longtime employees often spoke proudly of her generosity during holidays and difficult times. She remembered birthdays, attended charity meetings without complaint, and donated quietly to causes that rarely attracted media attention. Even the frightened village girl found herself wondering whether Richard's mysterious concerns could possibly be justified. Everything she had witnessed suggested that Evelyn Lawson was exactly the woman the public believed her to be. Yet Richard had not built a billion-dollar empire by relying on appearances alone. Somewhere beneath the polished image, his instincts had detected something he could neither explain nor ignore. The young village girl remembered the expression on Richard's face when Evelyn first entered the foyer that morning. It hadn't been anger. It hadn't been disappointment. It was the careful attention of a man who had learned that the smallest details often revealed the greatest truths. That memory refused to leave her, even as Evelyn continued treating everyone around her with apparent warmth and respect. As the days quietly unfolded, those small details Richard seemed to notice began revealing themselves one by one. They were not dramatic enough for anyone to immediately suspect wrongdoing, yet together they formed a pattern that was difficult to dismiss. Evelyn always appeared pleasant when greeting the household staff each morning, but there were certain employees she acknowledged only with a brief nod before quickly moving on. The young village girl noticed that one elderly housekeeper, who had served the Lawson family for nearly 20 years, seemed almost invisible whenever Evelyn entered the room. Conversations ended abruptly. Eye contact was carefully avoided. On several occasions, Evelyn changed direction entirely rather than pass through the same hallway as the woman. No argument ever took place. No harsh words were exchanged. Everything remained outwardly polite, Yet the quiet distance between them felt impossible to ignore. The village girl wondered whether they had experienced some disagreement years earlier, but no one spoke about it. Whenever she cautiously asked other staff members how long the elderly housekeeper had worked there, the answers became strangely brief before the subject quickly changed. It wasn't enough to accuse anyone of anything, but it was certainly enough to leave uncomfortable questions lingering in her mind. Then came the moments that were even harder to explain. Evelyn, whose public reputation rested upon remarkable patience and composure, occasionally reacted with surprising irritation over matters that seemed far too small to deserve such frustration. A dinner plate placed a few inches from its usual position drew an unusually sharp correction. A vase of fresh flowers arranged differently from the previous week earned an expression of annoyance that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. One afternoon, a chauffeur arrived less than 5 minutes behind schedule because of unexpected traffic near the estate, and although Evelyn remained composed, the disappointment in her voice felt noticeably stronger than the situation required. Each incident ended within moments, and she quickly returned to her usual gracious self, often apologizing before anyone could feel offended. Individually, these moments meant very little. Everyone has difficult days. Everyone loses patience from time to time. Yet for someone celebrated across the country for extraordinary composure, these subtle changes stood out more than they otherwise might have. The village girl quietly remembered Richard's instruction to observe everything carefully without drawing attention to herself. She began realizing that the truth he sought might not be hidden inside dramatic confrontations, but within the ordinary moments most people never considered important enough to remember. The most striking change, however, occurred whenever Richard Lawson left the mansion for business meetings or overnight trips. As long as he remained at home, Evelyn's daily routine followed a predictable rhythm of charitable work, household responsibilities, and social engagements. But shortly after his car disappeared beyond the front gates, something about her demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly. She spent more time behind closed doors. Phone conversations became longer and quieter. Certain members of the staff were instructed not to disturb her unless absolutely necessary, despite no obvious reason for the sudden privacy. On several evenings, she canceled appointments she had enthusiastically planned only days earlier, choosing instead to remain inside her private study until late at night. Nothing she did could be described as evidence of wrongdoing. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shocking discoveries, and no obvious betrayals. Yet each small change added another piece to an increasingly unsettling puzzle. The village girl found herself caught between two competing beliefs. One part of her still saw the generous woman admired by millions across America. The other could no longer ignore the quiet inconsistencies unfolding inside the mansion. Richard Lawson had trusted his instincts enough to risk placing a complete stranger at the center of his own household. Now, for the first time, the village girl began to wonder whether his fears had been born from imagination or whether they were leading toward a truth far more complicated than anyone was prepared to face. To understand why Richard Lawson had placed such extraordinary trust in a complete stranger, it is necessary to understand the young woman whose arrival had quietly unsettled the rhythm of the Lawson mansion. Her name was Grace Miller, and unlike the world she had just entered, her life had never been defined by wealth or privilege. Grace was raised in a small farming village where opportunities were scarce, dreams often surrendered to necessity, and every family depended on one another to survive difficult seasons. The modest wooden house she called home had weathered countless winters, its aging walls carrying memories of both joy and hardship. Her late father had spent his life working the fields until illness took away the strength that years of labor had already begun to steal. After his passing, the responsibility of caring for the household quietly fell upon Grace's shoulders long before she was ready. She never complained about the burden because she believed responsibility was not something a person chose when life became convenient. It was something they carried because the people they loved depended on them. While others her age dreamed of traveling or pursuing careers in distant cities, Grace measured success much more simply. If she could put food on the table, pay the overdue bills, and give her family one more reason to believe tomorrow might be kinder than today, she considered the day a good one. Those who knew Grace often spoke less about what she possessed and more about the values she refused to abandon. In a community where everyone knew everyone else's struggles, honesty was remembered long after money was spent. Grace earned that reputation through quiet actions rather than impressive words. If she borrowed a tool, it was returned in better condition than when she received it. If a neighbor needed help harvesting crops before an approaching storm, she was usually the first to arrive and the last to leave. Employers trusted her without hesitation because they knew she would complete every task with care even when no one was watching. She believed that character revealed itself in ordinary moments, especially when there was nothing to gain from doing the right thing. That quiet integrity eventually reached beyond the boundaries of her village through people who spoke highly of her work ethic, although Grace herself never imagined those recommendations would one day reach the attention of one of the wealthiest men in America. While countless applicants submitted polished resumes and glowing references in hopes of working for Richard Lawson, he found himself drawn towards someone who had never learned to impress people with carefully chosen words. Grace simply lived according to the principles she had been taught since childhood, never imagining they would open the door to a future she could not yet understand. At home, however, Grace carried a responsibility that made every opportunity impossible to ignore. Her mother had been battling a serious illness for several years, and although she fought each day with remarkable courage, the cost of treatment continued to grow beyond what the family could realistically afford. Medical appointments became more frequent. Prescription bottles filled kitchen cabinets that once held groceries. Every unexpected expense forced Grace to choose between paying another bill or purchasing another week of medicine. She worked multiple jobs whenever possible, cleaning homes during the day, helping at a local grocery store in the evenings, and accepting almost any honest work that came her way. Yet no matter how hard she worked, it always seemed as though life found another obstacle waiting around the corner. There were nights when she quietly sat beside her mother's bed after another exhausting shift, pretending everything would somehow work out while privately wondering how much longer they could continue. She never allowed her mother to see the fear she carried because she believed hope was sometimes the greatest gift one person could give another. When the unexpected employment opportunity from Richard Lawson arrived, offering compensation greater than she could earn in several years back home, Grace understood immediately that this could change everything. It wasn't about luxury. It wasn't about escaping her humble beginnings. It was about giving her mother the medical care she desperately needed and finally lifting a burden that had followed their family for far too long. That was why, despite the strange instructions and unanswered questions, Grace accepted Richard Lawson's offer. The amount of money promised upon successfully completing the assignment was enough to pay every outstanding medical bill, repair her family's aging home, and provide a future she had never dared imagine possible. Even so, Richard noticed the hesitation in her eyes. He understood that she was not driven by greed, because greed rarely pauses to ask difficult questions. Before she officially agreed to become part of his unusual plan, he invited her into his private study, closed the door behind them, and spoke with a seriousness that carried far more weight than the fortune he had promised. Looking directly at Grace, he chose his words carefully, knowing they would shape everything that followed. "You are here to clean my home." He allowed the silence to settle between them before continuing. "But what I truly need." His expression remained steady, revealing neither anger nor fear, only the quiet determination of a man searching for answers. "Dot is the truth." Grace felt the importance of those words immediately. This was never simply about housekeeping. It was never simply about earning money. Richard Lawson wasn't asking her to judge anyone or create problems where none existed. He was asking her to observe honestly, to remain patient, and to tell him only what she genuinely witnessed. At that moment, neither Grace nor Richard could have imagined how deeply those simple instructions would change the lives of everyone living beneath the roof of the Lawson mansion. Grace Miller settled into her new routine with remarkable discipline, careful never to draw unnecessary attention to herself. Every morning began before sunrise, long before most members of the Lawson household had awakened. She dusted the grand staircase, polished the marble floors until they reflected the morning light, arranged fresh flowers throughout the mansion, and quietly moved from room to room with the same diligence that had earned her respect back home. To everyone around her, she appeared to be exactly what Richard Lawson wanted them to believe. She was an ordinary village girl, grateful for an opportunity to work in a magnificent home. She spoke politely, listened far more than she talked, and avoided gossip whenever conversations drifted toward family matters. Yet beneath her calm exterior, Grace remembered every word Richard had spoken in his private study. She was there to clean the house, but more importantly, she was there to uncover the truth. She never searched through personal belongings or invaded anyone's privacy. Instead, she simply paid attention to the things most people ignored. The mansion followed routines so precise that even the smallest interruption stood out. It wasn't long before Grace realized that behind the polished elegance of the Lawson estate, tiny inconsistencies were beginning to appear with surprising frequency. Individually, they seemed harmless. Together, they formed the beginning of a puzzle that refused to leave her mind. The first thing Grace noticed was not something dramatic, but something quietly unsettling about certain members of the household staff. During the day, everyone performed their duties with professionalism, greeting one another warmly and working together without complaint. But whenever Richard Lawson unexpectedly entered a room, a few employees reacted in ways that felt strangely unnatural. Conversations stopped almost instantly. Some exchanged quick glances before returning to work as though nothing had happened. Others lowered their voices so abruptly that unfinished sentences simply disappeared into silence. One afternoon, Grace entered the laundry room just as two longtime employees were discussing something in hushed tones. The moment they noticed her, both smiled politely and changed the subject to the weather with an awkwardness that felt impossible to miss. Grace told herself she was probably imagining things. After all, every workplace had private conversations. Yet these moments became increasingly difficult to dismiss because they happened too often and always involved the same handful of employees. Even more curious was the fact that whenever Evelyn Lawson appeared, those same workers suddenly became unusually careful with their words, almost as though they feared saying the wrong thing in her presence. Grace couldn't determine whether they were hiding something from Richard, protecting Evelyn, or simply guarding secrets that had nothing to do with either of them. Still, another quiet question settled into her thoughts, waiting for an answer that had yet to reveal itself. A few days later, another unusual incident added to the growing mystery. During inventory, one of the senior housekeepers quietly mentioned that an expensive antique clock displayed in the East Wing could not be located. At first, no one seemed overly concerned. The mansion was enormous, and valuable items were often moved between rooms before charity events or private gatherings. Yet by the following week, a rare silver serving tray had also disappeared. Soon afterward, an antique pocket watch that Richard Lawson had reportedly inherited from his father could not be found. None of these disappearances caused public alarm inside the mansion. Staff members searched discreetly, assuming the missing items would eventually turn up. Evelyn Lawson remained calm, suggesting they had probably been misplaced during recent renovations. Richard said very little, carefully observing the reactions of everyone involved without making accusations. Grace noticed something else. Whenever another valuable object went missing, several employees appeared nervous long before anyone officially announced that an item had disappeared. It was as though they already knew something was wrong before anyone else did. She couldn't explain it, but the timing troubled her. Were the disappearances connected, or were they nothing more than unfortunate coincidences? Before Grace could reach any conclusion, another unexpected discovery demanded her attention. Hidden beneath the polished surface of the Lawson mansion, the mystery continued to deepen. The mansion changed after midnight. During the day, its grand halls echoed with quiet professionalism and orderly routines. But once darkness settled over the estate, an entirely different atmosphere emerged. On more than one occasion, Grace was awakened by the sound of raised voices drifting through distant hallways. The arguments never lasted long enough for her to understand what was being said, and by the time she cautiously stepped into the corridor, silence had already returned. Whoever had been speaking disappeared before anyone else could witness the confrontation. One night, while returning from the kitchen after preparing tea for an elderly housekeeper, Grace noticed a faint light beneath the door of a rarely used sitting room. As she quietly passed, she heard two voices engaged in what sounded like a tense discussion. One voice belonged to a man. The other was too soft for her to identify. She slowed her pace for only a moment before continuing, remembering Richard's instructions never to invite suspicion. The following morning, the room appeared untouched, every chair perfectly arranged as though no one had entered it at all. The incident lingered in her thoughts because it wasn't the first time unusual conversations had taken place after everyone was supposed to be asleep. Someone inside the mansion preferred conducting certain discussions under the cover of darkness, and whatever they hoped to conceal seemed important enough to risk being discovered. As the days passed, Grace became increasingly aware of patterns that were difficult to ignore. Certain phone calls were never answered inside shared rooms, but always behind closed doors. Several members of the household, including people whose responsibilities rarely overlapped, occasionally slipped away for brief meetings in parts of the estate that received little daily use. Once, while delivering freshly pressed linens to an upstairs hallway, Grace caught sight of two familiar figures emerging from the old library moments before they separated and walked away in opposite directions without acknowledging each other. Another afternoon, she noticed Evelyn Lawson ending a phone conversation the instant footsteps approached, replacing a serious expression with her usual welcoming smile before greeting guests as though nothing unusual had happened. None of these moments proved guilt. None offered the truth Richard Lawson had asked Grace to find. But each observation became another piece of an unfinished picture, another quiet reminder that appearances inside the Lawson mansion often concealed far more than they revealed. Every passing day answered one question only to create another. Every unexpected moment uncovered another hidden layer, and every clue seemed to point toward a truth that remained just beyond reach. Grace had entered the mansion believing she was accepting a housekeeping position. She now realized she had become the silent witness to a mystery that was only beginning to unfold. And somewhere inside those magnificent walls, someone was counting on the truth never being discovered. As the days turned into weeks, Grace Miller became a familiar face within the Lawson mansion, blending so naturally into the daily routine that most members of the household barely noticed her anymore. She carried out every assignment with quiet efficiency, never seeking attention and never inserting herself into conversations that did not concern her. If a room needed cleaning, it was spotless before anyone asked. If fresh flowers needed arranging, they appeared before breakfast. If an elderly employee needed help carrying supplies, Grace was always the first to offer assistance without expecting recognition. It was exactly the kind of consistency Richard Lawson had hoped for. The less attention Grace attracted, the more freely people behaved around her. They spoke openly while she polished furniture, discussed schedules while she served coffee, and often forgot she was standing only a few feet away. For Richard, this confirmed that he had made the right decision. Grace was not influencing events. She was simply witnessing them. But while the billionaire quietly appreciated her professionalism, another pair of eyes had begun following her movements with increasing curiosity. Evelyn Lawson, whose attention to detail had always been one of her greatest strengths, started noticing that the young village girl seemed to appear at unexpected moments. At first, the thought barely crossed her mind. After all, a maid's responsibilities naturally took her from one room to another. Yet as the days continued, those ordinary encounters began to feel less like coincidence and more like something she could not quite explain. It started with the smallest observations. Grace happened to be dusting the library shortly after Evelyn finished a private phone conversation. On another afternoon, she was arranging fresh towels in the guest wing, moments after Evelyn had returned from an unusually long meeting outside the estate. During breakfast one morning, Grace entered the dining room just as Evelyn was quietly discussing weekend plans with Richard. None of these situations were unusual on their own. Every member of the household followed busy schedules that frequently overlapped. Yet the repetition slowly planted an uncomfortable question in Evelyn's mind. Why did the new maid always seem to be nearby whenever something important was taking place? She never caught Grace listening behind doors or behaving inappropriately. In fact, Grace consistently apologized whenever she accidentally interrupted a conversation and immediately returned to her work. That should have been enough to ease Evelyn's concerns. Instead, the opposite happened. The more respectful Grace behaved, the more difficult it became for Evelyn to understand why she felt increasingly uneasy in her presence. It was an emotion she could neither justify nor completely dismiss, and for someone accustomed to trusting her own instincts, that uncertainty proved deeply unsettling. Richard Lawson unintentionally made those feelings even stronger. On more than one occasion, senior members of the household questioned whether Grace should be entrusted with responsibilities normally reserved for employees who had served the family for years. Rather than agreeing with their concerns, Richard calmly defended her. When one supervisor suggested assigning Grace to less important duties until she had earned everyone's confidence, Richard politely disagreed, explaining that she had done nothing to deserve such treatment. Another time, after a valuable vase was accidentally broken during preparations for a charity dinner, a staff member immediately assumed Grace must have been responsible simply because she was new. Before anyone could continue the discussion, Richard stepped forward, reviewed what had happened himself, and quietly pointed out that Grace had not even been working in that section of the mansion when the accident occurred. His defense was measured, fair, and supported by facts. But to Evelyn, it felt unusually personal. Richard had always treated employees with respect, Yet there seemed to be a different level of patience whenever Grace was involved. He never praised her excessively, nor did he spend unnecessary time speaking with her. Even so, his willingness to protect her from unfair criticism became impossible for Evelyn to overlook. She found herself asking questions she had never expected to ask. Why was Richard paying such close attention to an ordinary maid? What was it about this quiet village girl that inspired such confidence from a man who trusted so few people? Those unanswered questions slowly transformed into something far more dangerous than curiosity. Jealousy rarely arrives all at once. It grows quietly, feeding on uncertainty and filling empty spaces with assumptions that feel convincing long before they are proven true. Evelyn never accused Richard of inappropriate behavior, nor did she confront Grace with hostility. Instead, subtle changes appeared in her actions. She began assigning Grace to different sections of the mansion without explanation, only to change those assignments again hours later. She occasionally asked other employees where Grace had been throughout the day, disguising the questions as ordinary curiosity. During family dinners or social gatherings, Evelyn sometimes glanced toward Grace whenever Richard happened to acknowledge her work, however briefly. No one else seemed to notice these moments, but Grace certainly did. She sensed that Evelyn's once warm smile had become more measured, her conversations slightly shorter, her expressions more difficult to read. Grace could not understand why the atmosphere had changed, because she had followed Richard's instructions exactly. She avoided unnecessary conversations, completed every assignment faithfully, and never sought his attention. Yet despite doing everything she believed was right, she increasingly felt caught between two people whose quiet struggle remained hidden beneath polite words and carefully controlled emotions. The mansion still appeared peaceful to visitors, but beneath that calm exterior, invisible lines were beginning to form. The uncertainty reached a point where even Grace started questioning the purpose of Richard Lawson's extraordinary plan. Had he truly hired her only to observe the household, or had her very presence become part of a larger test affecting everyone around her? Evelyn's growing suspicions suggested that the experiment was beginning to influence the people it was meant to study. Richard remained patient, revealing nothing about his intentions, while continuing to watch events unfold with remarkable restraint. Evelyn, meanwhile, seemed determined to understand why this unfamiliar young woman had become such a quiet yet persistent presence within her home. Grace found herself standing at the center of questions she had never intended to create. Was Evelyn simply reacting to harmless coincidences? Or was her intuition warning her about something she could not yet explain? Was Richard protecting Grace because she was carrying out an important assignment, or because he already knew far more than anyone else inside the mansion? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all began to take shape without anyone speaking it aloud. In a house where every smile concealed uncertainty and every conversation seemed to carry hidden meaning, who was truly manipulating whom? The answer remained just beyond reach, waiting for a single mistake to expose everything that had remained hidden until now. While life inside the Lawson mansion appeared to continue as usual, Richard Lawson had quietly begun an investigation that reached far beyond anything anyone in the household could have imagined. He understood better than most people that confronting someone without undeniable evidence often destroyed the very truth a person hoped to uncover. Years of building one of America's largest business empires had taught him that patience frequently accomplished what anger never could. So instead of making accusations or revealing his growing concerns, Richard allowed every day to unfold naturally while he gathered facts, one careful step at a time. He maintained his regular business schedule, attended board meetings, hosted investors, and continued appearing beside Evelyn Lawson at public events where they smiled for photographs and spoke confidently about charitable projects. To the outside world, nothing had changed. Friends admired their marriage, business associates envied their success. Magazine articles continued describing the Lawsons as one of America's most respected couples. Yet behind the elegant image the public celebrated, Richard spent countless late evenings alone inside his private study, reviewing information that no one else knew existed. He had reached a point in life where instinct alone was no longer enough. If his fears proved unfounded, he wanted absolute certainty before allowing doubt to damage the people he loved. But if those instincts were correct, the truth would have to reveal itself through evidence rather than emotion. The first place Richard turned was the mansion's security system. Years earlier, after receiving advice from security consultants, he had approved the installation of an extensive network of cameras positioned throughout the estate. Their purpose had always been simple: protect the property, safeguard employees, and provide peace of mind whenever the family traveled. Until recently, Richard had rarely reviewed the recordings himself, trusting his security team to report anything unusual. Now, however, he requested weeks of archived footage without explaining why. Night after night, he sat before multiple monitors, watching ordinary moments that most people would dismiss as meaningless. He replayed hallways where employees crossed paths, studied entrances used after dark, and compared timestamps with household schedules. At first, the recordings appeared completely ordinary. Staff members carried out their responsibilities exactly as expected. Deliveries arrived on time. Visitors signed in according to established procedures. Yet as Richard slowed certain recordings and viewed them repeatedly, subtle inconsistencies began appearing. Individuals who claimed they had never entered particular areas of the mansion could occasionally be seen passing through those very hallways. Doors believed to remain locked overnight opened briefly before quietly closing again. Certain employees crossed paths far more frequently than their responsibilities should have required. None of these observations proved wrongdoing, but together they formed patterns too consistent to ignore. Richard knew that isolated incidents often meant very little. Repeated patterns, however, had a habit of leading toward uncomfortable truths. The investigation soon expanded beyond surveillance cameras. Richard instructed his trusted financial advisor to prepare years of household expense reports, maintenance invoices, insurance inventories, and accounting records connected to the mansion. Every purchase, repair, donation, and asset transfer was reviewed with the same precision he once applied to billion-dollar corporate acquisitions. At first glance, everything appeared remarkably organized. Receipts matched expenditures. Inventories balanced almost perfectly. Household budgets reflected responsible management. But experience had taught Richard that deception rarely announced itself through obvious mistakes. It often hid inside details too small for anyone to question. As the documents accumulated across his desk, several unusual transactions quietly attracted his attention. Certain expensive items listed for routine restoration had never actually been returned to their original display locations. Replacement purchases appeared for antiques that no employee remembered seeing damaged. Small payments authorized through different departments formed a pattern that individually seemed insignificant but collectively represented a surprising amount of money. Richard resisted the temptation to jump to conclusions. Financial irregularities sometimes resulted from ordinary administrative errors. Still, when those records were compared against reports of valuable possessions that had quietly disappeared from the mansion over recent months, another troubling possibility began taking shape. The missing antique clock, the silver serving tray, and the heirloom pocket watch Grace had heard discussed were no longer isolated incidents. They had become pieces of a larger mystery whose full picture remained frustratingly incomplete. Determined to understand what was happening inside his own home, Richard privately arranged conversations with employees who had served the Lawson family for many years. These were not formal interrogations but quiet discussions held away from the main household, where longtime staff members felt comfortable speaking honestly without fear of embarrassment or retaliation. Richard asked simple questions about daily routines, recent changes inside the mansion, unusual observations, and relationships among employees. Most conversations produced little beyond ordinary workplace concerns. Several praised Evelyn Lawson's generosity and described her as an employer who had supported them during personal hardships. Others spoke warmly about Grace Miller, remarking that the young village girl had earned respect through hard work and humility despite arriving only weeks earlier. Yet beneath those reassuring accounts, small inconsistencies gradually emerged. Different employees offered conflicting explanations about where certain valuables had last been seen. Timelines surrounding late-night activity failed to match one another. A few staff members became noticeably uncomfortable whenever discussions approached specific subjects, carefully choosing words that answered Richard's questions without truly explaining anything. One elderly housekeeper hesitated before mentioning that some employees had recently begun holding private conversations in areas of the mansion rarely used by the family, though she admitted she had never discovered the purpose of those meetings. Richard thanked each person sincerely without revealing his growing concerns. By the end of those interviews, he possessed more questions than answers, but one conclusion had become impossible to ignore. The truth was buried beneath layers of carefully maintained appearances, and every conversation seemed to expose another hidden contradiction. Recognizing that the matter could eventually affect far more than household routines, Richard quietly contacted the family's longtime legal advisors. They had represented the Lawson family for decades, overseeing business transactions, estate planning, charitable foundations, and every legal matter connected to the family's vast fortune. Meeting privately at his downtown office, rather than inside the mansion, Richard instructed the attorneys to review inheritance documents, ownership structures, trust agreements, and records relating to valuable family assets without informing anyone else, including Evelyn. The lawyers found nothing immediately alarming, yet they agreed to verify every document with exceptional care. Meanwhile, Richard compared their findings with everything Grace had observed. Every security recording he had reviewed, every financial discrepancy he had uncovered, and every conversation held behind closed doors. Instead of producing clarity, the investigation became increasingly complicated. Evidence seemed to point in multiple directions at once. One moment, suspicion appeared to settle upon a longtime employee. The next, an unexpected financial record shifted attention elsewhere. Even Evelyn's unusual behavior could be interpreted in more than one way. Was she concealing something herself, or protecting someone she believed deserved loyalty? As the pieces slowly gathered, Richard realized the greatest challenge was no longer discovering clues, but determining which ones actually mattered. Nothing inside the Lawson mansion was as straightforward as it first appeared. Every answer seemed to create two new questions. Every discovery introduced another possible suspect, and every person connected to the estate now carried secrets they had yet to explain. The investigation had reached a dangerous stage where appearances could no longer be trusted, and before long, someone would make a mistake that would change everything. By this point, nearly every quiet observation seemed to lead back to one person. Evelyn Lawson's unusual behavior, her carefully timed private phone calls, her growing discomfort around Grace Miller, and the subtle changes in her demeanor whenever Richard Lawson left the mansion had created a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Even Grace, who had promised herself never to judge anyone without undeniable proof, found herself wondering whether Richard's suspicions had been justified from the very beginning. The missing valuables, the late-night conversations, the unexplained meetings, and Evelyn's growing uneasiness whenever Grace happened to be nearby appeared to fit together almost too perfectly. Richard himself remained remarkably disciplined, refusing to accuse his wife despite the mounting questions. Yet there were moments when even he struggled to separate instinct from evidence. Every time another strange incident occurred, his thoughts inevitably returned to Evelyn. Had the woman he had loved for decades been hiding something behind the graceful smile admired by millions? Had his greatest success in business blinded him to the most important relationship in his own life? The audience could hardly be blamed for arriving at the same conclusion. Every clue seemed to point in a single direction, and with each passing day, it became easier to believe that the answer had been standing beside Richard all along. Then, without warning, the investigation took a direction no one expected. One evening, while reviewing another collection of security recordings, Richard noticed a detail so small that it would have escaped almost anyone else's attention. A longtime employee named Thomas Bennett, the mansion's trusted estate manager, appeared in several recordings at times that did not match the work schedules he had personally submitted. Thomas had served the Lawson family faithfully for nearly 25 years. Richard had trusted him with responsibilities that extended far beyond ordinary household management. He supervised maintenance projects, coordinated deliveries, oversaw renovations, and possessed access to nearly every room inside the estate. If someone needed to enter a restricted area, Thomas usually carried the necessary keys. His reputation inside the mansion was beyond question. Employees admired his fairness. Visitors respected his professionalism. Richard himself had often referred to Thomas as one of the few people whose loyalty had never needed to be questioned. Yet the security footage quietly suggested something that made no immediate sense. Thomas repeatedly appeared near locations where valuable items had later been reported missing. He was never seen taking anything. He never behaved suspiciously. Still, the pattern was impossible to ignore. For the first time since the investigation began, Richard felt his attention shifting away from Evelyn and towards someone he had trusted almost as much as family. Grace unknowingly uncovered another piece of the mystery only days later. While delivering freshly laundered linens to a storage room rarely used by the household, she accidentally overheard Thomas speaking in low tones with someone whose voice she immediately recognized. It belonged to Daniel Lawson, Richard's younger nephew, a man who frequently visited the estate under the pretense of discussing family investments and charitable projects. Daniel had always been welcomed into the mansion without hesitation. Richard had helped mentor him after the loss of Daniel's father years earlier, treating him less like a nephew and more like the son he had never had. No one questioned Daniel's presence because he had grown up inside those very halls. Yet the conversation Grace overheard was unlike any she had heard before. She couldn't distinguish every word, but she clearly caught fragments mentioning documents, schedules, and the importance of ensuring that Richard never finds out before it's finished. The discussion ended abruptly when footsteps echoed nearby, and both men exited through separate hallways as though they had never met. Grace remained frozen in place, uncertain whether she had just witnessed something deeply significant or completely misunderstood an ordinary business conversation. She said nothing immediately, choosing instead to remember Richard's instructions to report only facts rather than assumptions. Still, one unsettling realization refused to leave her mind. If Thomas and Daniel were secretly meeting without Richard's knowledge, what else had been happening beneath the surface of the Lawson family's carefully maintained reputation? Richard's legal advisors soon uncovered another unexpected inconsistency that complicated the investigation even further. While reviewing estate documents and financial authorizations, they discovered several recent requests for information concerning family trusts and ownership structures. The requests themselves were perfectly legal, but what caught their attention was who had initiated them. The paperwork had not come from Evelyn. Instead, certain inquiries had originated through channels connected to Daniel Lawson's financial office, with supporting documentation quietly processed by departments overseen by Thomas Bennett. Individually, none of the transactions suggested criminal behavior. Families often updated legal records, reviewed investments, and discussed inheritance planning. However, when those records were placed beside the security footage, the missing valuables, the unexplained meetings, and Grace's observations, an entirely different picture began to emerge. Richard sat alone in his study long after midnight, surrounded by files that no longer pointed toward a single suspect. The woman he had quietly suspected now appeared to occupy only one corner of a much larger mystery. Someone else had been moving unnoticed through the shadows of his own household, someone who possessed both opportunity and the trust necessary to remain invisible for years. The realization struck Richard with painful force. If Thomas Bennett and Daniel Lawson were connected to whatever was unfolding inside the mansion, then this was no longer simply a question about his marriage. It had become a question about betrayal from people he had welcomed into his life without reservation. For Grace, the emotional weight of the situation became almost overwhelming. She had entered the mansion believing she was there to help Richard discover whether Evelyn Lawson could be trusted. Now the investigation had expanded far beyond anything she imagined possible. Every new discovery challenged the conclusions that seemed so obvious only days earlier. Evelyn's unusual behavior suddenly appeared capable of several different explanations. Was she truly hiding something? Or had she noticed suspicious activity involving people she herself did not completely trust? Was Thomas Bennett secretly abusing the confidence Richard had placed in him? Or was someone manipulating him as part of a larger plan? And what role did Daniel Lawson really play? The answers no longer seemed simple. The mansion that once appeared divided between an innocent husband and a suspicious wife had become a web of hidden relationships, carefully guarded conversations, and loyalties whose true nature remained impossible to determine. The audience now faced the same uncertainty confronting Richard and Grace. The obvious suspect no longer looked so obvious. The most trusted employee had stepped into the spotlight. A beloved family member had become impossible to ignore. And somewhere inside the Lawson mansion, the person truly responsible quietly watched events unfold, confident that everyone was still looking in the wrong direction. Everything had changed, and the most dangerous revelation had yet to come. The atmosphere inside the Lawson mansion changed so gradually that no one could identify the exact moment everything began to feel different. The grand hallways still gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers. Fresh flowers continued to decorate every room, and visitors arriving for business meetings or charitable events saw nothing more than a household operating with its usual elegance. Yet beneath that carefully maintained appearance, an invisible line had quietly formed, separating people who had once worked together without hesitation. Conversations became shorter whenever unfamiliar footsteps approached. Friendly laughter disappeared the moment certain employees entered the room. Even shared meals in the staff dining area no longer carried the warmth they once had. Grace Miller sensed the change immediately. It wasn't something anyone openly discussed, but it revealed itself through cautious glances, unfinished conversations, and uncomfortable silences that lingered far longer than before. Richard Lawson noticed it as well, although he never acknowledged it publicly. The investigation, despite remaining known only to a handful of people, seemed to be influencing the entire household. Whether through instinct, rumor, or careful observation, many inside the mansion had begun feeling that something important was unfolding behind closed doors. The question was no longer whether secrets existed within the Lawson estate. The question had become who already knew about them and who was determined to keep them buried. Among the household staff, loyalties slowly began to shift in unexpected ways. Several longtime employees remained fiercely protective of Evelyn Lawson, refusing to believe that the woman who had supported their families during difficult times could possibly be involved in anything dishonest. To them, Evelyn was more than an employer. She had paid for surgeries when insurance failed, quietly covered tuition for employees' children, attended funerals, and celebrated weddings as though every member of the staff belonged to one extended family. Whenever Grace happened to ask innocent questions about routines or missing household items, those employees responded politely but cautiously, often changing the subject before the conversation could continue. They didn't accuse Grace of wrongdoing, but it became clear they viewed her growing presence with quiet suspicion. Some privately wondered whether the young village girl had arrived carrying motives she had never revealed. Others questioned why Richard Lawson seemed increasingly interested in her observations. Their loyalty to Evelyn remained unwavering, not because they possessed evidence proving her innocence, but because years of kindness had earned a level of trust they found impossible to abandon. To them, protecting Evelyn felt less like choosing sides and more like defending someone they believed deserved the benefit of every doubt. Yet not everyone inside the mansion shared that perspective. A smaller group of employees, particularly those who worked behind the scenes and rarely attracted attention, gradually found themselves helping Grace in subtle ways without openly declaring their intentions. The elderly housekeeper whom Grace had noticed during her first days quietly pointed out areas of the estate where unusual activity often occurred after dark. A maintenance worker casually mentioned which doors were seldom used during normal business hours and which corridors remained unusually busy late at night. One member of the kitchen staff discreetly informed Grace whenever unexpected visitors arrived without appearing on the household schedule. None of them openly criticized Evelyn Lawson, Thomas Bennett, or Daniel Lawson. Instead, they simply shared observations they believed Richard deserved to know, trusting Grace to determine which details truly mattered. They admired the young woman's honesty, recognizing that she never exaggerated stories or rushed to conclusions simply to satisfy curiosity. In return, Grace treated every conversation with respect, carefully separating facts from assumptions exactly as Richard had instructed. She understood that careless accusations could destroy innocent lives, and she refused to become the source of unnecessary suspicion. Even so, each quiet conversation added another piece to an increasingly complicated puzzle, whose full picture remained hidden just beyond reach. Then, without warning, the investigation took a far more unsettling turn. Early one morning, Grace discovered an unmarked envelope slipped beneath the door of her modest room in the servants' wing. There was no postage, no signature, and no indication of who had delivered it during the night. Inside rested a single sheet of paper containing only a short handwritten message. Some doors should never be opened. Go home while you still can. Grace read the words repeatedly, her hands trembling as she realized someone inside the mansion knew far more than they should. She had spoken to no one about Richard Lawson's private instructions. She had never revealed the true reason she accepted the position. Yet someone had not only noticed her growing interest in unusual events, but had taken the risk of warning her directly. She immediately informed Richard, who examined the note without displaying surprise. Instead of contacting the authorities, he quietly instructed his security team to preserve the envelope and review overnight surveillance footage without alerting the rest of the household. Unfortunately, whoever had delivered the message understood the mansion's routines remarkably well. The cameras covering the servants' corridor had experienced a brief interruption during precisely the same period the envelope appeared. Whether caused by equipment failure or deliberate interference, no one could immediately determine. What had begun as a quiet search for answers was now becoming something far more dangerous. The anonymous warning was only the beginning. Over the following days, small incidents occurred with increasing frequency, each one carrying the unmistakable impression that someone desperately wanted the investigation to end. Files Richard had carefully arranged inside his private study were discovered slightly out of place, though nothing appeared missing. Grace occasionally returned to storage rooms only to find objects she had organized mysteriously rearranged. Once, after reporting another unusual observation to Richard, she noticed someone standing at the end of a dimly lit hallway, watching her before disappearing around the corner. The instant she looked up, no confrontation followed, and she never caught a clear glimpse of the person's face. Meanwhile, Thomas Bennett continued performing his duties with flawless professionalism. Daniel Lawson maintained his regular visits to the estate, and Evelyn Lawson carried on with her charitable work as though nothing had changed. To any outsider, the Lawson family still represented stability and success. Inside the mansion, however, the pressure was quietly building. Someone had become frightened enough to issue anonymous warnings, manipulate security systems, and risk exposing their own presence rather than allow Richard Lawson to uncover the truth. The investigation had clearly moved closer to something significant, and whoever stood at the center of the mystery was no longer content to remain a silent observer. They were beginning to fight back, and the next move they made could expose everything Richard had spent weeks trying to uncover. Grace Miller had promised Richard Lawson that she would never go searching for secrets that did not naturally cross her path. She understood the difference between careful observation and invading another person's privacy, and throughout her time inside the Lawson mansion, she remained faithful to that promise. Every discovery she had shared with Richard had come through ordinary moments while carrying out her daily responsibilities. That discipline became even more important after the anonymous threats began appearing. Grace knew someone was paying attention to her movements, and the last thing she wanted was to give anyone a reason to accuse her of misconduct. Then, on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, fate placed her in the middle of something she had never intended to find. A powerful rainstorm swept across the estate, causing a leak in one of the older storage rooms located above the west wing. The senior housekeeper asked Grace to help move several boxes before the water caused permanent damage. It was the kind of routine task she had completed countless times before. Dust filled the air as she carefully lifted aging files and family keepsakes onto nearby shelves. While moving a heavy wooden chest that had apparently remained untouched for years, one of its weakened legs suddenly collapsed beneath the weight. The chest struck the floor with a dull crash, forcing its contents to scatter across the room. Grace immediately knelt to gather everything before moisture could ruin the papers. What she believed would be nothing more than old household records quickly became something else entirely. Among the scattered documents were several thick folders, unlike anything Grace had previously seen inside the mansion. Their covers contained no family crest, no company logo, and no labels indicating where they belonged. They appeared deliberately plain, as though someone had wanted them to escape attention rather than attract it. Grace's first instinct was simply to place everything back inside the damaged chest exactly as she had found it. Then a loose page resting near her feet caught her attention. Across the top were the words "Confidential Property Holdings," followed by a list of companies she had never heard of despite spending weeks inside Richard Lawson's household. As she carefully organized the remaining papers, more unfamiliar names appeared, each connected through ownership records that seemed unusually complicated. Before she could convince herself to stop looking, another folder slipped open, revealing financial statements showing enormous transfers of money between corporations that did not appear anywhere within the Lawson family's public business empire. The sums involved reached into the millions of dollars, moving quietly from one account to another through organizations whose names seemed intentionally designed to avoid recognition. Grace did not fully understand corporate finance, but she understood enough to realize these transactions were extraordinary. More importantly, she knew Richard had never mentioned anything about hidden companies or private financial networks. If these records belonged to him, why were they concealed inside an aging chest hidden in a neglected storage room instead of secured inside his office? The discoveries became even more unsettling as Grace continued gathering the scattered papers. Tucked inside another folder were photocopies of identification documents, bearing different names but featuring photographs of individuals she immediately recognized. One image appeared strikingly similar to a business consultant who had visited the mansion several times since her arrival. Yet the name printed beneath the photograph was completely different from the one everyone used when addressing him. Another document displayed a different identity connected to someone Grace believed worked for one of Richard Lawson's subsidiary companies. At first, she wondered whether the files belonged to a government investigation or some type of witness protection program, but nothing about the documents offered a simple explanation. Each identity was supported by separate addresses, financial records, and business registrations spread across multiple states. Everything looked remarkably authentic. Grace carefully examined the pages without removing anything from its original order, her heart beating faster with every passing moment. Were these false identities created to hide criminal activity, or were they part of a legitimate operation Richard had never discussed? She had entered the mansion believing the greatest mystery centered upon Evelyn Lawson, Thomas Bennett, and Daniel Lawson. Now entirely new questions had emerged, raising possibilities she had never considered. Whoever assembled these files had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal them, and their existence suggested that the truth behind Richard's investigation reached much farther than anyone had imagined. As Grace prepared to return every document to the damaged chest, one final item slipped from between two aging folders and drifted quietly onto the floor. Unlike the financial records surrounding it, this was a handwritten letter folded carefully with obvious age. The paper had yellowed over time, and portions of the ink had begun fading, yet the handwriting remained surprisingly clear. There was no official letterhead, no business signature, and no indication that it had ever been intended for public view. Grace hesitated before reading it, fully aware she was standing at the edge of something deeply personal. Even so, a single sentence near the top immediately caught her attention. If anything ever happens before I can explain everything, you must never trust appearances, because the greatest danger will come from the people everyone believes are protecting you. Grace read those words twice before slowly lowering the page. The letter mentioned no names, offered no dates, and revealed no direct explanation of what had taken place. Yet its tone carried unmistakable urgency, as though the writer had anticipated betrayal long before anyone else recognized the signs. Before she could continue reading, footsteps echoed outside the storage room. Startled, Grace carefully returned every document to the damaged chest exactly as she had found them, placed the handwritten letter beneath the remaining files, and quietly resumed moving boxes just as another employee entered to inspect the leaking ceiling. The opportunity vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving Grace with only fragments of information and a growing sense that she had stumbled upon something far more significant than missing valuables or secret conversations. That evening, Grace sat alone inside her small room in the servants' wing, unable to silence the questions racing through her mind. Richard Lawson had trusted her enough to reveal that he suspected something was wrong inside his own home. He had warned her to observe carefully, remain patient, and tell him only the truth. Yet he had never mentioned hidden corporate records, mysterious financial transfers, carefully maintained alternate identities, or an old handwritten letter warning against trusting appearances. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, Grace found herself wondering whether Richard had withheld important parts of the story from her intentionally. Perhaps he believed she would be safer knowing less. Perhaps he feared involving her in matters that extended beyond the household. Or perhaps there were truths even he was unwilling to confront until the right moment arrived. Whatever the reason, one conclusion had become impossible to ignore. Richard Lawson had not told her everything. The assignment she believed centered upon testing his wife was connected to a much larger mystery, one whose roots stretched far beyond the walls of the Lawson mansion. And if the hidden documents were telling even part of the truth, then everyone involved, including Richard himself, might already be caught inside a plan that had begun long before Grace Miller ever stepped through those iron gates, carrying her worn suitcase. The discoveries Grace Miller made inside the old storage room changed more than her understanding of the investigation. They changed the way she looked at Richard Lawson himself. Until that moment, she believed she understood her role inside the mansion. Richard had hired her to quietly observe the household because he feared something had changed in his wife, Evelyn Lawson. Every unusual conversation, every missing valuable, every late-night meeting, and every anonymous threat appeared to support that belief. But the hidden documents, the unexplained financial records, the alternate identities, and the forgotten letter suggested there was another layer to the story that Richard had never shared with her. For the first time since accepting the extraordinary assignment, Grace questioned whether she truly knew the man who had entrusted her with such responsibility. Had he concealed important details to protect her, or had she unknowingly become part of an investigation much larger than she had ever imagined? Richard had always spoken carefully, revealing only enough information to guide her without influencing her judgment. At first, Grace admired that restraint. Now she wondered whether it had served another purpose entirely. She remembered the calm expression on Richard's face when he first looked into her eyes and said, "You are here to clean my home, but what I truly need is the truth." At the time, those words sounded simple. Now they carried a meaning she had not understood. Perhaps Richard had never been asking for one truth. Perhaps he had been searching for many. Late one evening, Richard quietly asked Grace to meet him in the same private study where their unusual arrangement had first begun. The room felt different now. Weeks earlier, Grace had entered as a frightened young woman, uncertain whether she had made the right decision. This time, she carried questions that could no longer remain unanswered. Richard stood beside the large windows overlooking the estate, his hands resting behind his back as rain tapped gently against the glass. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. When he finally turned toward her, the confidence that had defined him throughout the investigation seemed mixed with something else. It was the expression of a man carrying the weight of difficult decisions rather than easy answers. Before Grace could mention the hidden documents, Richard surprised her by speaking first. He admitted there were parts of the investigation he had intentionally kept from her, not because he doubted her honesty, but because he feared that too much knowledge would unintentionally influence her observations. He explained that genuine truth often disappeared the moment people realized they were being watched. Grace listened quietly, unsure whether to feel relieved or disappointed. She had devoted herself completely to helping Richard uncover the truth, only to learn that the story she believed she understood had never been complete. Yet even then, Richard had revealed only the beginning of what he had been carrying in silence. Richard slowly walked toward an old wooden cabinet and removed a thick folder that appeared even older than the files Grace had discovered in the storage room. Carefully placing it upon the desk between them, he spoke words that left Grace completely speechless. This was never only about Evelyn. The sentence hung in the silence like a confession years in the making. Richard explained that his growing concerns had begun long before he noticed changes in his wife's behavior. Over several years, small inconsistencies had appeared throughout every corner of his life. Trusted employees offered conflicting explanations for routine matters. Business associates who once displayed unwavering loyalty quietly changed their priorities. Family members became increasingly interested in inheritance discussions while pretending to ask harmless financial questions. Even charitable organizations connected to the Lawson family occasionally produced reports that failed to match official records. At first, Richard investigated each incident separately, believing they were isolated misunderstandings. Eventually, he realized they shared one troubling connection. Every inconsistency involved people who had earned his trust over many years. The possibility that so many respected individuals could be connected seemed almost impossible to accept, yet ignoring the pattern became even harder. That realization led him to design an extraordinary test unlike anything he had ever attempted in business or in life. Grace had never been brought into the mansion solely to observe Evelyn Lawson. She had been placed there to observe everyone. The truth grew even more astonishing as Richard continued. Every person inside the Lawson mansion had unknowingly become part of the same carefully constructed experiment. Thomas Bennett had no idea his routines were being quietly compared against years of security records. Daniel Lawson believed his private meetings had escaped notice, unaware that legal advisors were independently reviewing financial inquiries connected to his office. Household employees who treated Grace with kindness or suspicion had revealed their own character without realizing their everyday choices were quietly exposing far more than words ever could. Even the anonymous threats delivered beneath Grace's bedroom door became valuable evidence, not because they frightened Richard, but because they proved someone inside the estate feared the truth enough to abandon caution. Richard explained that wealth often encouraged people to present carefully crafted versions of themselves, making genuine character increasingly difficult to recognize. By introducing someone like Grace into the household without revealing her true purpose, he removed expectations, titles, and assumptions from every interaction. Those who believed they were dealing with an ordinary village girl behaved according to their natural instincts rather than calculated appearances. Some responded with compassion, others with suspicion, a few with fear. Richard watched quietly as each person unknowingly revealed pieces of themselves they had never intended anyone to see. Grace suddenly realized why he had chosen someone from a humble farming village instead of an experienced investigator. A detective would have been watched. An ordinary maid became almost invisible. Then Richard revealed the one truth Grace never expected to hear. His voice became noticeably quieter as he admitted that even his own family had never been excluded from the test. His children, whom he loved beyond measure and had worked his entire life to protect, knew nothing about the investigation unfolding around them. They believed Grace had simply been hired through the normal employment process, just as everyone else did. Richard confessed that making this decision had been one of the most painful choices of his life, but experience had taught him that affection could never replace certainty. He refused to build the future of his family upon assumptions, no matter how uncomfortable the search for truth became. If his children valued people according to wealth rather than character, he needed to know. If they ignored honesty in pursuit of personal gain, he needed to know. If they remained loyal when no reward appeared possible, he needed to know that as well. Grace listened in complete silence as the full weight of Richard's plan finally became clear. Evelyn Lawson had never been the only person under observation. Thomas Bennett had not been the only trusted employee whose actions mattered. Daniel Lawson had not been the only relative being quietly evaluated. Every conversation, every decision, every act of kindness or deception had become part of a test no one realized they were taking. Not the staff, not the family, not Richard's children, and, in a revelation that left Grace struggling to catch her breath, not even Grace herself, Richard looked directly into her eyes with the same calm expression she remembered from the day they first met. He gently admitted that throughout these weeks, he had also been watching the young village girl who believed she had been chosen only to uncover the truth. Without ever realizing it, Grace Miller had been revealing her own character every single day, proving something Richard Lawson had quietly hoped was still possible in a world where trust had become harder to find. Grace Miller left Richard Lawson's study carrying a burden far heavier than the one she had brought into the mansion weeks earlier. The worn suitcase that had once held her few belongings seemed insignificant compared to the questions now filling her mind. Richard's confession had changed everything. The investigation had never been limited to Evelyn Lawson, nor had it been directed solely at Thomas Bennett, Daniel Lawson, or the missing valuables. Every relationship inside the mansion had become part of an elaborate search for the truth. Yet despite finally understanding the true purpose of her assignment, one mystery remained unresolved. Richard still had not answered the question that had started everything. Why had he grown suspicious of Evelyn in the first place? If she had been only one piece of a much larger puzzle, then what role had she actually played? Grace realized there was only one person capable of answering those questions. Until now, Evelyn had remained largely silent, responding to unusual events with careful composure while allowing everyone else to draw their own conclusions. But silence can only last so long before the weight of unanswered questions becomes impossible to carry. The time had finally come for Evelyn Lawson to tell her side of the story, and what she revealed would force everyone to reconsider nearly every conclusion they had reached since Grace first stepped through the gates of the Lawson estate. The opportunity came unexpectedly. Richard invited Evelyn into the library late one evening after most of the household had retired for the night. Grace remained nearby only because Richard had specifically asked her to stay, explaining that if the search for truth had involved her from the beginning, then she deserved to hear the answers as well. When Evelyn entered the room, she immediately sensed that something significant was about to happen. She looked first at Richard, then briefly at Grace, before quietly closing the door behind her. For several moments, no one spoke. The silence between husband and wife carried the weight of years rather than minutes. Finally, Richard calmly admitted that he had spent weeks investigating unusual events inside the mansion and quietly observing everyone connected to the family. He expected anger. He expected disappointment. Instead, Evelyn slowly lowered her eyes and released a long, weary breath that sounded less like surprise and more like relief. It was the reaction of someone who had been carrying an exhausting secret alone for far too long. Grace watched closely, uncertain what to expect next. Richard had prepared himself to hear explanations, excuses, or perhaps even denials. What followed instead was something none of them had anticipated. Evelyn spoke softly, her voice steady despite the emotion beginning to show across her face. She admitted that she had noticed many of the same strange events Richard had observed. Valuable possessions disappearing without explanation. Employees behaving differently when they believed no one important was watching. Family conversations that ended the instant she entered the room. Financial questions being raised by people who had never previously shown interest in the family's affairs. She confessed that these incidents had troubled her for months, yet she had deliberately chosen not to confront Richard immediately. Grace looked at her in disbelief. Richard's expression remained unreadable. Evelyn explained that years earlier, Richard had once told her that powerful people often attracted dishonest individuals who survived by creating confusion and encouraging mistrust. Those words stayed with her. Instead of accusing anyone without proof, she quietly began watching the household herself. She avoided certain employees not because she feared them, but because she suspected they were already watching her. She ended phone calls whenever footsteps approached because several private conversations with the family's attorneys had convinced her that someone inside the mansion might be listening. Her unusual behavior whenever Richard left home had never been about hiding secrets from her husband. It had been about using his absence to observe people who behaved differently whenever they believed the owner of the estate was away. Suddenly, the very actions that had made Evelyn appear guilty now seemed capable of carrying an entirely different meaning. Grace felt her certainty slipping away with every sentence Evelyn spoke. The evidence that once seemed so convincing no longer appeared as straightforward as before. Had Evelyn's growing suspicion toward Grace truly been jealousy, or had she simply become concerned after noticing an unfamiliar employee appearing near sensitive conversations? Had her irritation over seemingly insignificant matters reflected hidden guilt, or had it been the frustration of someone quietly trying to maintain order while watching relationships inside the mansion slowly unravel? Even her distance from the elderly housekeeper took on new significance when Evelyn explained that she had noticed confidential family matters somehow becoming known among employees who should never have had access to such information. Rather than accusing the elderly woman directly, Evelyn chose to limit unnecessary conversations until she understood how private details were spreading through the household. Grace suddenly remembered how often assumptions had shaped her own understanding of events. Every clue she uncovered had seemed to point naturally toward Evelyn, because that was where the earliest suspicions had led. Now, for the first time, she realized how easily ordinary actions could appear suspicious when viewed without complete context. Richard himself remained silent, carefully comparing Evelyn's explanations with weeks of observations he had gathered independently. Nothing she said immediately disproved his investigation, but neither could it be dismissed. The certainty that had guided everyone only days earlier dissolved into uncertainty once again. Then Evelyn revealed one final detail that changed the entire conversation. She quietly admitted that several months before Grace arrived, she had received an anonymous letter warning her that someone close to the Lawson family intended to exploit Richard's complete trust for personal gain. The letter contained no names, no evidence, and no demands. It simply urged her to pay close attention to people whose loyalty appeared unquestionable. At first, she dismissed it as a cruel attempt to create conflict within the family. But as unusual events continued multiplying throughout the mansion, she could no longer ignore the possibility that the warning contained some measure of truth. She chose to investigate privately because she feared that accusing the wrong person without evidence would permanently damage the family Richard had spent his entire life protecting. Looking directly at her husband, Evelyn admitted that she had noticed his own quiet investigation weeks earlier. She recognized changes in his routine, unusual meetings with attorneys, and his growing interest in household affairs. Yet she deliberately remained silent because she believed they might unknowingly be searching for the same truth from different directions. Grace could hardly believe what she was hearing. The husband had been investigating the wife. The wife had been conducting an investigation of her own. Neither fully trusted the other with what they had discovered, yet both believed they were acting to protect the same family. By the time the conversation ended, every certainty had disappeared. Evelyn Lawson no longer fit neatly into the role of a guilty wife hiding dangerous secrets. Yet neither had she fully explained every unanswered question surrounding the mansion. Was she genuinely protecting Richard from a threat she could not yet identify? Had someone manipulated her into doubting innocent people, while the real culprit quietly remained hidden? Or had she become so skilled at presenting herself as the victim that even this heartfelt explanation formed part of a larger deception? Grace could no longer answer those questions with confidence. Richard, despite hearing everything his wife had revealed, remained cautious enough to avoid reaching immediate conclusions. The audience now stood in the same uncertain place as everyone inside the Lawson mansion. One moment, Evelyn appeared unquestionably guilty. The next, she seemed courageous enough to risk misunderstanding in order to protect the people she loved. Then another possibility emerged, suggesting she might still be controlling events from behind an image of innocence. With every new revelation, loyalty shifted once again. Every answer challenged the one before it, and the search for truth became more complicated than ever. In the Lawson mansion, appearances continued to deceive, and the person truly responsible still remained hidden behind a carefully constructed mask. Richard Lawson spent the next 48 hours saying very little. Those who knew him well understood that his silence was never a sign of uncertainty. It was the calm that came before an important decision. Throughout his years of building one of America's most successful business empires, Richard had earned a reputation for refusing to act on emotion alone. He believed that once a decision was made, there should be no need to revisit it because every fact had already been carefully examined beforehand. Now that same discipline guided his final steps. Every report from his legal advisors was reviewed one last time. Every security recording was compared against employee schedules and financial records. Grace Miller's observations were carefully organized beside statements collected from longtime staff members. Anonymous letters, missing valuables, bank transfers, hidden documents, and weeks of carefully documented conversations all rested neatly across the large conference table inside his private office. Nothing would be left to assumption. Nothing would depend upon memory alone. Richard understood that the truth, once revealed, would permanently change the lives of everyone connected to the Lawson family. There would be no opportunity to return to the comfortable illusion that had existed before Grace walked through the gates carrying her worn suitcase. Whatever happened next would reshape relationships built over decades, and there would be no way to undo the consequences. On the morning of the meeting, every member of the Lawson household received the same unexpected instruction. Richard requested their presence inside the mansion's grand ballroom, precisely at 10 o'clock. No explanation accompanied the invitation. Family members assumed it involved estate planning or a charitable announcement. Employees quietly speculated that recent rumors surrounding the household would finally be addressed. Security personnel arrived earlier than usual after receiving confidential instructions from Richard's office. The family's longtime legal advisors entered carrying sealed files and locked briefcases, taking seats near the front of the room without speaking to anyone. Grace Miller stood quietly near the back, dressed in the same modest maid's uniform she had worn since the day she arrived. She felt completely out of place among wealthy relatives, respected attorneys, senior executives, and trusted household employees, yet Richard had personally insisted that she be present from beginning to end. Evelyn Lawson entered moments later, composed as always, though Grace noticed the unmistakable seriousness in her expression. Thomas Bennett greeted several employees with his usual professionalism, while Daniel Lawson appeared calm enough to suggest he believed this gathering concerned ordinary family business. No one realized they were about to witness the most significant moment in the history of the Lawson family. The room filled with quiet conversations that gradually disappeared the instant Richard Lawson stepped onto the small platform at the front of the ballroom. Richard looked across the room for several long seconds before speaking. His eyes rested briefly upon every face, from family members to gardeners, accountants to security officers, attorneys to housekeepers. When he finally broke the silence, his voice carried neither anger nor bitterness. It carried disappointment. He began by thanking everyone for their years of service, friendship, and loyalty, before acknowledging that trust had become the foundation upon which both his family and his business empire had been built. Then, without raising his voice, he revealed that for several weeks he had quietly conducted an investigation inside his own household. Audible gasps echoed across the ballroom. Confused glances spread from one person to another. Richard explained that Grace Miller had not been hired by accident. Her arrival had formed part of a carefully designed effort to observe how people behaved when they believed they were interacting with someone who possessed neither wealth nor influence. Grace lowered her eyes as dozens of surprised faces turned toward her. Several employees who had dismissed her as an ordinary village girl suddenly realized they had unknowingly revealed far more about themselves than they ever intended. Richard emphasized that Grace had never manipulated anyone, never searched for private information, and never violated anyone's trust. She had simply observed what naturally unfolded around her. Then Richard quietly thanked her before making a statement that filled the room with stunned silence. The greatest value Grace brought into this mansion was not information. It was honesty. In a house where nearly everyone believed appearances mattered most, she reminded me that character always reveals itself eventually. The revelations that followed unfolded one by one with remarkable precision. Richard first addressed the missing valuables that had quietly troubled the household for months. His legal advisors produced documentation showing that the antique clock, the heirloom pocket watch, and several other valuable possessions had not been stolen at all. Instead, they had been secretly transferred into secure storage by Richard himself as part of his investigation, allowing him to observe who would attempt to exploit their disappearance for personal advantage. Attention quickly shifted toward financial records linking Thomas Bennett to a series of unauthorized administrative approvals. Thomas immediately stood to defend himself, insisting he had acted only after receiving requests he believed were legitimate. Richard calmly presented security footage confirming that Thomas had repeatedly met privately with Daniel Lawson while discussing matters neither had disclosed to the family. Daniel attempted to explain that their conversations concerned future investment opportunities intended to strengthen the family's charitable foundation. The attorneys quietly placed additional documents upon the table, revealing that several companies connected to those discussions existed only on paper and had quietly received substantial financial transfers through a network of shell corporations. The room fell silent. Daniel's confident expression disappeared for the first time. Thomas slowly lowered his head as the evidence became impossible to dismiss. Neither man had anticipated that Richard had spent weeks assembling information from multiple independent sources, rather than relying upon isolated incidents alone. Then came the revelation that shattered the remaining illusion of unity inside the Lawson family. Richard confirmed that Evelyn Lawson had indeed been conducting her own investigation, independent of his, after receiving anonymous warnings months earlier. Rather than working against him, she had been trying to identify the same hidden threat from a different direction, fearing that exposing her suspicions too early would allow the real culprit to erase every trace of evidence. Security records, attorney correspondence, and private notes recovered during the investigation supported her explanation. For the first time since Grace entered the mansion, Richard publicly acknowledged that his wife had never betrayed him. Instead, both husband and wife had spent months quietly protecting one another while unknowingly pursuing the same truth. Relief spread across Evelyn's face, but it lasted only a moment before another painful realization settled over the room. The deception they feared had not originated from their marriage. It had come from people they had welcomed into their lives without hesitation. Daniel Lawson's attempts to gain greater access to family-controlled assets, combined with Thomas Bennett's willingness to approve transactions without proper verification, had created opportunities that threatened not only Richard's fortune, but the legacy generations of the Lawson family had worked to build. Whether driven by greed, poor judgment, or misplaced loyalty, the consequences could no longer be ignored. When the meeting finally drew to its emotional conclusion, the Lawson family would never be the same again. Richard announced immediate legal action to recover every improperly transferred asset, dissolve fraudulent corporate structures, and remove individuals who had violated the trust placed in them. Thomas Bennett, once regarded as one of the family's most dependable employees, quietly accepted responsibility for choices that ended a career spanning nearly a quarter of a century. Daniel Lawson, unable to deny the overwhelming evidence presented before him, left the ballroom in complete silence, fully aware that the future he had expected to inherit had vanished in a single morning. Employees who had chosen integrity found themselves reassured that honesty had not gone unnoticed, while those who had remained silent despite recognizing troubling behavior were forced to confront difficult questions about their own decisions. Grace Miller stood quietly near the back of the room, overwhelmed by everything she had witnessed. She had arrived believing she was simply accepting a housekeeping job to help care for her sick mother. Instead, she had become the unlikely catalyst for exposing truths that no amount of wealth could permanently conceal. As family members struggled to process broken relationships, shattered assumptions, and irreversible consequences, one reality became impossible to escape. Fortunes could be rebuilt, businesses could recover, valuable possessions could be replaced. But once trust collapsed, no amount of money could restore it to what it had once been. And although the greatest secrets had finally been revealed, one final decision still remained, one that would determine whether the Lawson family's future would be defined by revenge, forgiveness, or something far more extraordinary. The days following the extraordinary gathering inside the Lawson mansion were unlike anything the household had ever experienced. The elegant estate that had once echoed with carefully rehearsed conversations now felt unusually quiet, as though every room carried the weight of truths that could no longer be ignored. Attorneys worked tirelessly to reverse fraudulent transactions, and dissolve the network of shell companies uncovered during Richard Lawson's investigation. Financial institutions cooperated with legal authorities, frozen accounts were reviewed, and records stretching back several years were examined with painstaking detail. Employees who had remained loyal continued their duties with a renewed appreciation for honesty, while those whose judgment had been clouded by fear or misplaced loyalty quietly accepted the consequences of their actions. Thomas Bennett left the estate with the dignity of a man who understood that one poor decision could overshadow decades of faithful service. Daniel Lawson disappeared from public view as legal proceedings moved forward, forcing him to confront the painful reality that ambition without integrity ultimately destroys the very future it seeks to secure. Richard and Evelyn Lawson slowly began rebuilding the trust that secrecy and suspicion had strained, not by pretending the past had never happened, but by choosing complete honesty moving forward. Through it all, Grace Miller returned to her ordinary routine, continuing to clean rooms, help the kitchen staff, and greet every employee with the same quiet respect she had shown from the day she first stepped through the mansion gates. She never behaved as though she had become the central figure in one of the most important moments in the Lawson family's history. In her heart, she still considered herself nothing more than a village girl grateful for the opportunity to help her mother. Richard Lawson, however, knew that Grace's role had been far greater than she would ever admit. Several days after the investigation officially concluded, he invited Grace to the mansion's private garden just as the sun began setting across the estate. It was the same peaceful place where he often reflected before making life-changing business decisions. Yet this conversation carried far more personal significance than any corporate negotiation ever had. Waiting beside him was Evelyn Lawson, whose expression now reflected gratitude rather than uncertainty. The family's legal advisors stood nearby holding several official documents, while a representative from Richard's financial office carried a sealed envelope prepared specifically for Grace. Richard thanked her for every difficult moment she had endured during the investigation. He acknowledged the anonymous threats she had received, the pressure of remaining silent while suspicions surrounded nearly everyone she met, and the remarkable honesty she had demonstrated despite never fully understanding the true scope of the assignment. Then, in front of everyone present, Richard instructed the financial representative to hand Grace the envelope. Inside was documentation transferring an extraordinary reward into her name, a sum of money large enough to ensure that neither she nor her family would ever struggle financially again. It was more wealth than Grace had ever imagined seeing in a lifetime. Richard explained that the payment reflected not only the agreement they had made when she accepted the assignment, but also his deep appreciation for the courage, wisdom, and integrity she had displayed throughout one of the most difficult periods of his life. Everyone expected Grace to accept the reward without hesitation. After all, she had traveled to the mansion because her mother's medical treatments had become almost impossible to afford. She had sacrificed weeks of her life, faced danger from anonymous threats, and unknowingly participated in an investigation that changed the future of one of America's wealthiest families. No one would have blamed her for accepting every dollar Richard offered. The attorneys quietly smiled, believing they were witnessing the well-deserved conclusion to an extraordinary story. Even Evelyn nodded gently, convinced that nothing could be more appropriate than seeing Grace return home with financial security beyond her wildest dreams. Grace looked down at the documents resting in her hands for a long moment before carefully placing them back inside the envelope. She took a slow breath, looked first at Richard, then at Evelyn, and finally at the people gathered around them. Her voice remained calm, though emotion filled every word she spoke. She thanked Richard for honoring his promise and admitted that the money would certainly solve many of the hardships her family had endured. But then she quietly explained that accepting far more than they originally agreed upon would change something inside her that she had spent her entire life protecting. She reminded Richard that he had chosen her because he believed she valued truth over personal gain. If she accepted an enormous fortune simply because circumstances now made it available, she feared she would no longer be the same person he trusted enough to bring into his home. The garden fell completely silent. No one interrupted her. No one even seemed to breathe. Grace continued, her words leaving every person present struggling to hide their emotions. She explained that her mother had always taught her one lesson above all others. Honest work should provide enough to meet genuine needs, but character should never carry a price. She admitted that she would gladly accept the payment Richard originally promised because it represented the agreement they had both freely entered. It would allow her to pay for her mother's treatment, repair their family home, and begin a better future through honest effort. Everything beyond that, however, belonged to someone else who truly needed it. Grace gently suggested that Richard establish additional scholarships for young people from struggling rural communities, support families unable to afford life-saving medical care, or expand the charitable programs Evelyn Lawson had devoted years to building. "There are children growing up exactly as I did," she said softly. "If this money can give them opportunities they would never otherwise have, then it will accomplish far more than it ever could sitting in my bank account." Tears quietly filled Evelyn's eyes. The attorneys lowered their heads in respectful silence. Richard Lawson, a man who had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without revealing emotion, found himself unable to speak. Throughout his remarkable career, he had encountered brilliant executives, powerful politicians, celebrated philanthropists, and influential investors. Yet standing before him was a young woman who owned almost nothing, asking him to use extraordinary wealth for the benefit of complete strangers rather than herself. For several long moments, Richard simply looked at Grace without saying a word. Then a quiet smile slowly appeared across his face, the kind that comes only when a person discovers something they feared no longer existed. He finally understood why every carefully designed test inside the Lawson mansion had led to the same conclusion. Grace Miller had never been extraordinary because she uncovered hidden documents or noticed suspicious behavior. She was extraordinary because temptation never changed the principles she carried into the mansion on the day she arrived with nothing more than a worn suitcase and hope for her mother's recovery. Richard gently closed the envelope containing the additional fortune and placed it back into the hands of his financial advisor. Looking directly at Grace, he said something that no one present would ever forget. "I spent years believing I was searching for people worthy of my trust. Today I discovered something even greater. The richest person standing in this garden isn't the one with the largest bank account, it's the one whose values cannot be purchased." In that unforgettable moment, Richard Lawson realized that the person who possessed the least money had demonstrated the greatest wealth of all. Not wealth measured in dollars, properties, or investments, but the kind that survives every test life places before it: integrity. And for the first time in many years, Richard knew with absolute certainty that no fortune on earth could ever equal its value. Several months passed after the extraordinary events that transformed the Lawson mansion, and with time, the silence that once followed every shocking revelation slowly gave way to something far more meaningful. The estate itself looked much the same from the outside. The iron gates still welcomed visitors. The carefully maintained gardens continued to bloom throughout the seasons, and the grand halls still reflected the elegance that had made the Lawson family one of the most respected names in America. Yet anyone who truly knew the household understood that nothing inside those walls remained the same. The investigation had not simply uncovered hidden documents, exposed secret financial transfers, or revealed dishonest decisions. It had forced every person connected to the Lawson family to confront a far more difficult question. Who were they when no one believed they were being watched? That question lingered long after lawyers closed their files and financial records were corrected. It followed every conversation, every handshake, and every decision made inside the mansion. The greatest lesson Richard Lawson uncovered had never been hidden inside a bank account or locked inside an old wooden chest. It had been quietly revealed through ordinary moments when people believed their choices carried no lasting consequences. Those ordinary moments had changed every life connected to the estate forever. Richard Lawson continued leading his companies, but those closest to him noticed a remarkable difference in the way he approached both business and family. He still demanded excellence, still made difficult decisions, and still protected the empire he had spent decades building through sacrifice and discipline. Yet his priorities had shifted. Meetings with investors no longer occupied every available hour because he deliberately reserved time for the people who mattered most. He expanded the charitable foundation he and Evelyn had built together, directing new resources toward education, healthcare, and opportunities for families from rural communities whose struggles reminded him of Grace Miller's childhood. More importantly, Richard stopped measuring loyalty by words alone. He understood that genuine character revealed itself through consistent actions performed when recognition was neither expected nor guaranteed. He no longer assumed trust simply because someone had remained close for many years, nor did he dismiss people because they lacked wealth or influence. Grace had taught him that honesty often arrived in the most unexpected places, carried by individuals the world rarely noticed. That lesson became more valuable to Richard than any business strategy he had ever developed, and it shaped every important decision he made from that day forward. For Evelyn Lawson, the months that followed became a season of healing rather than regret. She and Richard spent long evenings discussing the mistakes both had made, acknowledging that even love can become vulnerable when fear replaces honest communication. Instead of allowing the investigation to create permanent distance between them, they chose to rebuild their marriage upon complete openness, refusing to let silence create opportunities for misunderstanding again. Evelyn expanded her charitable work with renewed determination, personally overseeing new scholarship programs for young people growing up in forgotten communities across the country. She insisted that one of those initiatives quietly bear Grace Miller's name, though Grace never sought recognition and remained deeply uncomfortable whenever anyone praised her publicly. Evelyn also strengthened relationships with the household employees who had demonstrated unwavering integrity during the difficult weeks of uncertainty. She never forgot those who had chosen honesty even when it offered no personal advantage. At the same time, she carried compassion for individuals whose poor choices had damaged lives, recognizing that justice and mercy could exist together without weakening either one. Her public image remained admired by society, but those who truly knew her understood that the greatest change had taken place privately, where humility had replaced every remaining trace of pride. The servants of the Lawson mansion found themselves forever shaped by the extraordinary events they had witnessed. Those who quietly protected truth despite uncertainty became trusted members of a household built upon renewed respect rather than fear. Younger employees often listened as the elderly housekeeper shared the remarkable story of the village girl who arrived carrying an old suitcase and unknowingly changed one of America's wealthiest families forever. New staff members occasionally noticed a simple framed quotation displayed inside the employee dining room, placed there at Richard's request. It read, "Character is what remains after every disguise has been removed." No names appeared beneath the words because everyone inside the mansion already understood where the lesson had come from. Thomas Bennett accepted responsibility for the choices that ended his distinguished career and quietly devoted himself to rebuilding his life away from public attention. Daniel Lawson faced the legal and personal consequences of ambition that had overshadowed integrity, learning through painful experience that shortcuts to success often lead only to permanent loss. Their stories became solemn reminders that trust, once broken, requires far more effort to rebuild than it ever did to earn in the first place. As for Grace Miller, she returned to her village exactly as she had promised. She accepted only the payment Richard Lawson had originally offered, using it to secure the medical treatment her mother desperately needed, restore their modest family home, and create honest opportunities through hard work rather than dependence upon extraordinary wealth. Richard quietly honored Grace's request by establishing scholarships and charitable programs that transformed countless lives without attaching her name to every act of generosity. Grace preferred it that way. She never sought interviews, accepted public awards, or allowed newspapers to celebrate her as a hero. To her, the greatest reward had never been recognition. It was the knowledge that she could look into her mother's eyes every evening without regretting a single decision she had made inside the Lawson mansion. She remained the same humble young woman who had first walked through those towering gates carrying a worn suitcase, proving that genuine integrity does not appear only during life's greatest tests. It is revealed every ordinary day through quiet choices that no one else may ever notice. Richard and Evelyn visited Grace and her mother from time to time, not as wealthy benefactors, but as friends whose lives had been permanently changed by someone the world might otherwise have overlooked. Their friendship endured because it had never depended upon money, power, or status. It had been built upon something far more valuable. Perhaps that is why this story continues to resonate long after its final chapter. Wealth can purchase magnificent homes, successful businesses, elegant celebrations, and almost every comfort life has to offer. It can open doors, attract admiration, and surround a person with endless opportunities. Yet it cannot purchase genuine loyalty, honest friendship, or unconditional love. Those gifts remain beyond the reach of even the greatest fortune because they must be freely given rather than bought. Richard Lawson spent a lifetime believing that his greatest achievement was the empire he had built from humble beginnings. In the end, he discovered that his greatest blessing arrived not through another business victory, but through a young village girl who reminded him that the strongest foundation any life can stand upon is integrity. Trust, once broken, carries a painful cost. Deception often promises temporary rewards, but leaves lasting scars behind. Character, however, quietly outlives every fortune, every title, and every success because it is the one possession no one else can take away. And as this remarkable journey comes to an end, perhaps the most important question is not about Richard Lawson, Evelyn Lawson, or Grace Miller at all. It is about every one of us. If you had unlimited wealth, how would you know who truly loved you and who only loved what you could give them? Just when it seemed the story had finally come to an end, time quietly added one last chapter that few people ever heard. Years passed, and the Lawson Foundation grew into one of the country's most respected charitable organizations, providing scholarships to students from small rural communities, funding medical treatment for struggling families, and creating opportunities for people whose circumstances once looked impossible to overcome. Although Richard Lawson's name appeared on the buildings, he often insisted that the true inspiration behind the foundation was someone the world had almost overlooked. During interviews, charity events, and leadership conferences, people frequently asked him the same question. After building a billion-dollar empire, completing countless successful business deals, and creating one of the nation's most admired companies, what had been the greatest investment of his entire life? The audience always expected him to mention a company acquisition, a bold financial decision, or a piece of property that multiplied in value over the years. Richard would simply smile, pause for a moment, and quietly shake his head. Then he would tell them about a frightened young village girl named Grace Miller, who arrived at his mansion one peaceful morning, carrying nothing more than a worn suitcase and an honest heart. He would explain that she possessed no famous family name, no expensive education, no powerful connections, and no fortune waiting for her. Yet she carried something that many wealthy people spend their entire lives searching for but never truly find. She carried integrity that refused to bend under pressure, honesty that could not be purchased, and compassion that remained unchanged even when extraordinary wealth was placed within her reach. Richard always ended with the same unforgettable words. The greatest investment I ever made wasn't in a company, a building, or the stock market. It was opening the gates of my home to a young woman carrying a worn suitcase who reminded me that integrity is the only wealth that never loses its value. And perhaps that is why some stories stay with us long after they did end. Because fortunes can rise and fall, businesses can succeed or fail, and fame can disappear with time. But a life built upon truth, character, and unwavering integrity leaves behind a legacy that no amount of money can ever replace.